Hello and welcome back to the show. Today we welcome three special guests, Jason, Melanie and Justine. The three wrote a paper that came out this year in February about the CMNs, the common mycorrhizal networks, the Wood Wide Web. So trees talking to each other, big trees giving nutrition to the smaller seedlings, and so on. And what they found out is that it's actually not that way. It's actually the other way around, that trees are not very kind to each other oftentimes, or that we just don't know. We just don't know, but the public opinion is so strong about the Wood Wide Web, about the magic forest, that it is important to talk about that. More data to that, more information to that, you'll find in the last episode about the CMNs, where we talk a lot about the paper and what they found out. Today, we're going to talk about the feedback. Like, what was it? What was the science community doing? How were they reacting to that? How's the public opinion about that? What is the work we need still to do? And with that, I'll leave you to it. Enjoy this episode. So last time we were here, we discussed the CMNs, the common mycorrhizal networks, and the myths about them, and what was the common knowledge or the stigma about the magic forest talking to each other, and old trees when they die, that they pour a lot of nutrition into the ground and to support their seedlings or whatever. And we kind of painted a new picture with the paper that was published by you three, like Justine, Melanie, and Jason, and I'm happy to have you here today. So today we talk about the response and the feedback that was thrown to you, or that came up after you published your paper. So Justine, what was the feedback from maybe the science community? What was the response from them?
Well, the first time that we had some feedback was probably after a conference. So the conference was the International Conference on Mycorrhizas. So the paper had not actually been published yet, but we had been working on it, and we were at the point that we had results and conclusions and an abstract that we submitted to the conference, and then I presented there. And I was very nervous about presenting at the conference. This is our peers. This is our scientific community. These are the people in the world that are, focusing on mycorrhizal ecology. And so I gave the talk, and there was, as with all conferences, there's not a lot of time for questions, but a little bit. And so the questions and comments, I guess I would categorize them as surprise, maybe a little bit of disbelief, and definitely some pushback. But to be fair, this was the first time that our community, I think, had heard our conclusions, had heard our results, and nobody changes their minds in 10 seconds after hearing a talk. So you need time to process, you need time to digest, you need time to look at the data. But that was probably the initial response. But again, that was before the paper had come out. But I would say yes, there was some pushback from the research community there. And then after our paper, well, again, it sort of happened in stages, because after that, we had a New York Times article came out that was basically saying we're skeptical of some of these claims. But again, our paper hadn't come out, and there again, I would say, there was a little bit of pushback. The New York Times
article, they were supporting your position, or they were skeptical about your claims?
No, the New York Times. So in that article, it was, I wouldn't say it was sort of supporting or not. It was just covering the fact that we were skeptical of these popular claims. So again, our paper had not come out. We had been working with the journalist for quite some time. He was interested after I presented at the conference, and I tweeted our abstract in case, there's a lot of people that can't attend a conference. But to kind of let the public and research community know that we had some questions, we were skeptical, and our results were not pointing in the direction to support these popular claims. And so that journalist reached out to us, and then and he was interested to know our side of the story. And so that was what the New York Times article was about. But there were also other scientists, of course, giving their thoughts and response to our skepticism. And so, and we could talk about what was in the comment section, because that was a real mixed bag. But ultimately, finally, in February, the paper came out, and the three of us, I think, were very excited because now the public and the research community could get a lot of traction with our arguments. Up to that point, it was really just sort of listening to what we had to say, but they could not look at the same data. They couldn't look at our conclusions in detail and look at our arguments in detail. And once the paper came out, I would say that so most of the scientists that contacted me over email were generally very positive. But the public, again, was very mixed, I would say. Jason, Melanie, what would you add? Yeah.
Maybe Melanie, what was your reaction, or what was the reaction you received most, or the feedback, Melanie?
Well, I suspect that Justine got the majority of the feedback, but I guess if I have to summarize my impression of the feedback, was that the vast majority of the scientists were very positive about the fact that we had done such a critical analysis of the published evidence for these claims about common mycorrhizal networks. The main criticism, if I can frame it that way, of what we had said was people as scientists, mycorrhizal scientists, I think in general feel, and I'm gonna use that word, feel that as more evidence unfolds, that we will find these common mycorrhizal networks are present in all sorts of kinds of forests. And so they were maybe uncomfortable that we were saying, but look, there's not that much evidence yet. And when pushed, they agreed that yes, the firm evidence only exists in these two forest types. But, really, we're probably going to find it everywhere else. So they felt maybe a little bit uncomfortable about the first statement that these mycorrhizal networks might not be ubiquitous everywhere. But I think I was really most struck by the comment that Marc-André, who you interviewed earlier, made in an article in Le Monde, where he talked about that he felt the mycorrhizal research community, that most people would feel relieved by the fact that our article came out. And I think what he was referring to was that people in the mycorrhizal research community had become more and more uncomfortable with some of the statements that were being made in the public media. But of course, it takes a lot of time. We invested a lot of time in rereading all of the literature and describing the consensus from that literature. And so most people don't have the time to do that, or the inclination. So I think they were relieved that somebody had done that and had indeed found that there's not a lot of evidence for some of the more extraordinary claims.
With relieved, what exactly do you mean? Because was the pressure so high, or was the story growing more fantastic?
I think what
with each study.
I can imagine that by relief, what they meant is, I mean, it could mean a number of things, but I know that many of us had been asked, once somebody found out that we worked on mycorrhizal networks, I know I got the question quite often, is it true? You know, is what I'm reading in these books or hearing on, watching on TV, is it true? And, you know, even myself and I think Justine and Jason felt the same way, that we didn't know quite how to answer, because you don't want to answer just on your general impression of what you've been reading, even in the literature. As we've said several times, at first we thought that maybe we'd been missing something, missing some key papers that had been published that had shown evidence. So for some of these claims. And so we didn't, you know, you would feel uncomfortable saying, no, it's not true, just because it sounded unrealistic. So I think some of the relief was probably that someone had, meaning us, had actually done the work of going through and documenting what evidence was there. And so now there is a peer-reviewed published paper that mycorrhizal scientists and other people can turn to say, okay, this is what we know. So there's some relief in that they have a reliable document to turn to, and probably relief that there is something, just something published that really lays out what evidence is there to maybe counter some of the more outrageous claims in the public media.
Yeah, makes sense. Jason, how was it for you?
Well, I think I would echo what Justine and Melanie said. I think Melanie's description of the relief in the scientific community is, that was my experience also. That was the overwhelming sentiment that I heard from colleagues privately. And I think it's exactly right that there had been a growing discomfort in the scientific community, but with the claims being made, but no one had really dove in detail enough to be able to provide a scientific response. And I felt this deeply myself when I was first asked to comment for a different New York Times article more than a year ago about the subject. I did not feel comfortable at the time making very strong statements because I had not done a careful analysis and no one else had either. And so I felt, I got feedback from a lot of colleagues who felt very glad that we had done this. Whether or not they disagreed with a point here or a point there, they were very glad to have the analysis out there. And I would say that that was the strongest sentiment I received. There were a few disagreements, especially with our commentary on the first point and the strength of that. And that was, but even that, I feel very good about the dialogue that has emerged from that with colleagues, because it's, we've highlighted the uncertainty, and now there's a discussion about what is the evidence. And that's really what we wanted to focus on.
Was it, did you also receive, so in general, the feedback from the science community was pretty good, relief, what I hear from what you say. But was there also feedback from maybe the science community who did the studies that you kind of disproved, or was there any kind of feedback?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll let Justine take the lead on responding to that. But I would say that we certainly had some inquiries from scientists whose papers we mentioned in our analysis, who wanted to engage in a dialogue about the details, and that has been really productive and interesting. And we've had really positive back and forth with several of the scientists whose papers we mentioned in our paper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So definitely, yeah, I mean, we looked at a lot of different papers, and some of those authors had reached out, and it was really good. Like those are the kinds of discussions that we need to be having in terms of like, well, here's how I set it up. This is what we were testing for in the experiment. Here's what we found. And just some of that conversation doesn't always make it into a paper. And those are the kinds of conversations you have at a conference or over email or whatever else. So, like Jason, I'm really happy with those discussions because I think that it's raising the bar in terms of like everyone having to step back a little bit and think, okay, so those are the results. What do they mean? What don't they mean? Are there alternative explanations? These are all very, very good and productive discussions to have. And I think, and I'm hopeful that in the next set of experiments that happen in the field and the lab, that our paper can add some, what's the word? Just rethinking about how we do experiments, what they mean, and shaping kind of the future experiments in the field and the lab. So those discussions have been very, very, I would say, high caliber with colleagues and other scientists. What has been more tricky is sometimes dealing with the public. And that's understandable. The public they don't always have this view as to the process of science, how experiments are set up, falsification. That's not necessarily their world, but definitely, and not with all of the public, but just some. There is this they want to believe. They want to believe in something, and it doesn't matter what the scientists say. They just want to believe that the forest is always going to be more complex, more mysterious than scientists will ever know, and that just because we don't have evidence that trees are talking, it doesn't mean it can't happen. And that is probably the number one pushback I hear, and sometimes from scientists as well, is that we haven't shown that they don't talk. And when I'm saying the trees talk, I'm saying it in a very loose,
Yeah.
like communicator or whatever, and I'll just leave it at that. So it's still a possibility, and they really hang on to that. And I guess the only issue I have with that is, I mean, it's true on one hand that we haven't shown that trees don't communicate with another. Like a lot of the evidence is inconclusive. And so it's still a possibility. But the problem is when you're trying to manage forests or set policy, like we have to be using the most robust science and evidence that we have. And, it's the same thing when you talk about like, well, aliens might exist, but it's like, okay, but we don't walk around and talk about it as fact, though. We don't communicate it in science classes as a fact just because it might happen. And it's the same thing with tree communication through mycorrhizal networks. It might happen, but we have to be careful that we're using language of what is known right now. Yeah.
So to say, we can't prove it, but we also can't disprove it. So I think that was please, Jason.
Yeah, on that point, I totally agree with what Justine was saying. But on the second claim that we discussed, which was about whether trees benefit from mycorrhizal networks, we do have some quantitative data. In that analysis, we discussed caveats and alternative explanations that are important to consider. But we also discussed how if you set aside those caveats from those experiments and you just look at the outcomes of those experiments, in fact, we have results that show that the benefits to trees of potentially connecting through these fungal networks are all over the place, and often they're not positive. Often these mycorrhizal networks seem to have negative effects or neutral effects on seedlings in forests. And so the claim that these mycorrhizal networks benefit trees is really sweeping under the rug the fact that most of the results actually point towards that not being the case. Or at least we need to consider that the benefits are very context dependent, and sometimes they may be beneficial, these networks, and sometimes not. Those are real data that are out there. We're not just saying there's no data, there's no evidence. There is some evidence showing that these effects may be very, really variable and often not positive.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for that. Yeah.
And what I hear is also that we can prove it, we can disprove it, but also what we see is that the data is pointing in the opposite direction of the public opinion that was built up within the last decades or years or last time, and that the trees may be, to stay in that, may be talking to each other, but they are more insulting each other than helping, so to say.
Well, I think, there's a couple of things going on. When we're talking about trees talking, we should probably clarify a little bit. So there's the communication. So they're sending resources to each other through a common mycorrhizal network. They're sending signals to each other through a common mycorrhizal network. That's what I would sort of put in the communication. And then there's the other part of like, what are the functional consequences for seedlings or other trees in terms of like growth, survival, that kind of stuff. And so in what Jason has clarified, which I agree with, is when you look at the data that we have right now, it does not point in the direction of this popular claim that seedlings benefit from having access to mycorrhizal networks. What we would say is inconclusive, I think, is whether resources are transferred through a mycorrhizal network. There's definitely studies that show that mycorrhizal networks are not necessary for small amounts of resources to be transferred between trees or seedlings. And then the other one about the warning signals, it's never been tested in a forest. And so that's, who knows, maybe when the experiment is actually done in a forest, we'll know something. But that one, we just can't even say. It remains to be demonstrated because it's never been done.
And that is why I was asking about the feedback or from the scientists who did the experiments that you went through. Because when I remember correctly, you also said that there was insufficient data and some experiments weren't just not done. They weren't done, and or maybe the false conclusion were driven from the topics. Or Melanie?
Yeah, I think I hope one of the consequences of this paper will be a reset of the mindsets of researchers studying mycorrhizal associations in forests, because I think what was starting to happen was this creeping acceptance that mycorrhizal networks were everywhere in forests, and just what Jason and Justine were talking about, that there was this benefit to seedlings, and that the networks were a really important route for transferring nutrients around between trees. And so I think amongst mycorrhizal scientists, what I hope our paper will do is to say, no, the evidence is not strong, or the evidence is highly variable. The results are highly variable about the effects of common mycorrhizal networks on seedlings. We need to do more research about how widespread these networks are. How long do they live? Over what distance are they actually functionally connected? And further to Jason's point, under what conditions do we find that there might be some benefit to seedlings, or this vast majority of cases where there's no effects or negative effects? What's really driving that? So I'm hoping that this paper will really recharge and invigorate the field of research on common mycorrhizal networks, and just point out how much more research we need to do, and with an awareness of some of the shortcomings of the approaches that have been used up till now.
Did your paper, not you personally, but did your paper stop anything? And what I mean with that is, how far away was the public opinion about that, and were there some things that were driven from this false narrative that trees are talking, so to say, that now we have to be saving the trees even more. Did you stop anything with that you are aware of? Like
You go ahead,
giving
Justine. I'm not sure I
giving
really
rights to
understand the
trees or so?
I think I understand the question. So there is a huge wave of enthusiasm and popularity for the Wood Wide Web. And okay, so our paper just came out in February, so it hasn't been that long, but I would say at least once a week there is still misinformation coming out about the Wood Wide Web. So like I'm on Twitter, and at least once a week I'm seeing some major organization or corporation making some false statement about the Wood Wide Web. And there's been documentaries that have come out this year that are still spreading misinformation about the Wood Wide Web. And to be fair, our paper just came out in February. So a documentary would have been made a year and a half ago that's just released now. So they wouldn't have been able to update the misinformation. But they're certainly making some extraordinary claims about the Wood Wide Web, trees talking. So the cynical part of me is like, I don't even know if we've made a dent. But on the other side, we have reached out to a couple of big organizations, broadcasters, and let them know, hey, your video contains misinformation. Here's the misinformation. Can you please take it down? So we have been slowly working at that. But again, we're a few weeks into it. Nothing's happened. I would say that there was one article that came out a little while ago, and I reached out to the editor and the author, and they did make a change right away when I let them know, like, okay, actually, this is misinformation. There's no evidence to support this. But that was rare. In most cases, I get, and I don't know about you, Jason, I don't get any responses from these larger organizations that are making this misinformation. So in that respect, I feel like nothing as much has changed. I don't know. Am I being a total... what do you think, Jason? Am I being overly cynical?
Well, yeah, I don't think... that sounded like a pretty accurate description to me of what's going on. Yeah, we're just chipping away right now, I think, but we haven't had that much time either, and this paper was just the first step, and there will be more papers coming that are related. We're aware of another publication that will be coming out soon that is from a different viewpoint, analyzing it kind of a different from a different perspective, some of the same questions that we think will be pointing in the same direction. Our respective labs will have more work coming out on the scientific side that will, further the dialogue. And we're also working on, starting to think about, generating some media, working with media production experts to, create scientifically based products that talk about these things in a way that is still intriguing and captivating regarding forests and fungi, but also, true to what we think the data really show. And so, yeah, in some ways we're just getting started. Also, I would say that some of the voices who have been the most involved in making claims about the Wood Wide Web, the stories seem to be evolving a bit, and in a way that I think is positive, maybe in reaction to our paper.
I can imagine that changing, especially the public opinion, will be very hard. Because also what I could imagine is that the media is not very interested in publishing your story because it's not so sensational, because it's the other way around. You're trying to turn back the clock to normal. Like the trees are just normal. We don't know, or we don't
Yes.
know. And that's not the stuff that papers are writing about. They want sensational stuff where the public is shocked with, and that's not very. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's right. And what we're seeing right now is that a lot of the stories, even recent ones that are really trumpeting these narratives about the Wood Wide Web, are being recycled and retweeted and amplified. And I think it's because exactly for those reasons that you mentioned. It's a more positive story in some ways. And so, Justine has been really trying hard to engage, on Twitter, for example, to point out the evidence, the analysis of the evidence that is now available in the form of our paper, and but it's an uphill battle still right now in that respect.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
But but I do celebrate the small wins. Like, it still matters to me if I've changed one person's mind, or it just left them with some questions, like, oh, I thought it was like that, but now after talking to you, Justine, or after reading your paper, I'm not so sure anymore. And to me, that's great. Like, I don't think we ever expected to change the world's mind on this. But all I wanted was that if someone was interested, they could go back to our paper and they could go somewhere to find out what is the current evidence. And then that was available to them. And there'll be lots of people that are not concerned with what the most current evidence is or read of the literature, and they'll continue believing whatever they want. But for anyone who is interested, there's somewhere to go now to check and say, okay, this is actually what we really know on the topic. And to me, that was why one of the main reasons I did it, and one of the most important contributions I think that we have made.
And with that said, Justine, maybe can you tell the people who want to look up your paper where they can best find it, or find you guys to discuss things?
Yeah, it's very easy to find our emails. You just have to Google us and then find our university emails. I'm always happy to take questions. I've had a number of people say that have heard me or seen me on Twitter and then have reached out through email, and I'm very happy to have those dialogues. So that's the easiest way. I'm on Twitter. The paper is published, so it's published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Maybe is there notes for the podcast? Because we could put a link to the. Yeah, okay. So we could put a link to the paper if anyone's interested. If it's paywalled for them and they can't download it, tell them they should feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we can send them a PDF copy.
Yeah, sure. Guys, thank you very much for being here today and shining another light on that important topic with CMNs, the Mycorrhiza Networks, and the Wood Wide Web, and that the conclusion is still the same. We need more data. We need more good science on that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having us on the show, Luca.
Yes, thank you very much, Luca.
Thanks, Luca. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys. And guys, thank you again for listening and tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Share it wherever you feel need. Leave some love at Spotify and Apple Podcasts with some reviews. And see you next episode. Bye-bye.